How does a democracy plan? I remember asking a very well-placed colleague, very bright, very plugged-in colleague a few years ago, how does a country like Canada or Britain or the United States, Australia, France, how do they plan? And the answer was, unfortunately, quite glib. He said, Irvin, they don't plan. Democracies don't plan. That sounds very Soviet, almost Chinese. We don't plan. And that struck me as an answer not from thinking, but rather from ideology. There's responding to the word rather than the concept. And the answer, of course, was nonsensical. Of course democracies plan, they have historically, and indeed they must if they're going to do anything of consequence long term. And certainly if they're going to be able to compete with countries that are successfully planning, like China and Singapore, the sharper end of the planning states today. So we have a bit of a problem of ideology and dogmatism leading intellect in the democratic space today, because the answer of my distinguished colleague, it can be generalized to many professionals and citizens across the democratic space today. We've become very ideological. We really believe our stuff, and much more ideological than, I would say, the Chinese or the Russians, the other two large traditions of statecraft and culture in the world. You won't believe it, but the Americans, between the Americans, the Russians, and the Chinese, it is the Americans who are the most ideological, who are the thickest in their ideological belief and self-belief. Certainly more than the Russians, who I would say largely don't believe in anything in ideological terms, and I'll explain why. And certainly more than the Chinese, who have an ideology, but it is still quite a young, pragmatic, malleable ideology, and it is based in many ways on the idea of pragmatism. And the reason that the Russians and the Chinese are much less ideological is quite obvious if you think about it. They're much younger countries. Russia is a very young country. So they had the ideology, the Soviet ideology, that has been discarded into the dustbin of history, as it were. And the Russians and all the post-Soviet states are making up their ideology. They're pretty much looking everywhere and instinctually and improvising where they can. And maybe they call it ideology after the fact, but it's not informed by ideology, their behavior. It's largely informed by improvisation and the leadership of the day. China, also quite a young country, given the age of Chinese civilization. It's a young country and built on the axis of pragmatism. So we have an ideology in the West, and led by the Americans, and we have a lot of it in Canada as well, that is old already, because these states are old, particularly North America. But it's problematic because in many cases we're falling behind in places where our ideology does not allow us to move. Consider planning. So I go back to my fundamental question, my starting question. How does a country like Canada or the United States plan? How do we plan long term? Because it's obvious we're not planning long term. We don't have it in us. We don't have the structures. We don't have the political mentality. And it gets more acute for a country like Canada, and to some extent the United States. How does a federation, a federal democracy plan across the different jurisdictions? It's even more complicated. And that is the central governance question for Canada for the foreseeable future. One not really asked today, but explains a lot of our deficiencies and a lot of our opportunities. There are two types of basic states in the world today. And by the way, they're not, as we tend to believe in the West and in Canada and the United States in particular, led through ideology that it's good versus bad, or democratic versus authoritarian, which is the slogan du jour. Rule of law versus non-rule of law. These are, to my mind, conceptual nonsenses because they don't explain accurately what's happening. The two major types of states are what I call algorithmic states, China and Singapore leading them. Algorithmic states, algorithmic, and not democratic states, but argumentative states. The algorithmic states rule or are governed by a central algorithm, a plan, which is unfurled and generalized on the population and on the machinery of government over time. 5-year plans, sometimes 10-year plans, up to 50-year plans. That's sort of the bureaucratic and political imagination in this space, right? And by the way, it's working. Now, I'm not doing a hagiography. There are a lot of pathologies, lots of problems, particularly in China, 1.5 billion. Singapore is just a city-state. It's about the size of Toronto demographically for all intents and purposes. And so it's difficult to compare the two, but they operate in the same tradition. In many cases, actually, Singapore influenced China, which generalized it to a huge state. Algorithm. There's a national plan. It's generalized. It's biblical in its importance. It's iterated. It's corrected. It's taken extremely seriously. Algorithmic. There's an argumentative state, which we like to call democratic, but I like to put the word democracy aside because automatically connotes some sort of moral superiority or some sort of morality play where it's largely irrelevant to proper analysis because it's not obvious that one is morally superior than the other. There are different types of government. And authoritarian does not properly capture this, or non-democratic also suggests that there's some sort of pathology happening there. The more important thing is that these are states like Canada, the USA, most of the EU, Australia, New Zealand, and a few other states, maybe Israel at the margins, but only at the margins, that like to argue about process and constantly contest power through elections, but also through what I would call feedback mechanisms from media, the academy, civil service, opposition, and so on. They argue at all points, and there is no national plan. And the national planning or the national long-term achievements happen through accretion of successive governments and successive national pushes. But seldom do you see in the United States or even in Europe a successful 10, 20-year plan whereby a country is able to push through a centralized algorithm. Okay? So these are the two dominant traditions today, and they're much more informative for the groups of countries that are in between these traditions than the narrative of democracy versus non-democracy. Now, of course, China and Singapore and these argumentative states don't cover much of the world, and much of the world is looking actively to pivot to one of these traditions. These are what I call voyeur states. The voyeur states are actually engaged in political and policy, structural, constitutional voyeurism. They're looking at all these traditions, at these two dominant traditions. They're saying, which way should I pivot? Which lessons should I take from Canada or Britain or France, Germany, Portugal, and which one should I take from China, Singapore? And maybe I'll do some from each, or maybe I'll take one tradition in total and I'll pivot there too. So you have all of these states in the former Soviet Union, in Africa, in most of Asia, and particularly in the Middle East, and certainly in the Americas, pivoting and absorbing these lessons between, again, argumentative and algorithmic traditions, not in any morality terms, democratic versus authoritarian. And you see that particularly in the example of, let's take some of the post-Soviet states. You take Kazakhstan. So the voyeur states, again, are looking to pivot between the argumentative and the algorithmic traditions, or they're looking for some sort of what I call hybrid governance between the two traditions, which probably is the smartest approach. You take the best of each tradition and you guard against the worst. And let's get to that best and worst. In the algorithmic space, okay, the real strength is planning. And again, planning not in ideological terms, but planning as an exercise in human foresight and long-term execution. You want to build a bridge, you want to build a subway, you want to build public infrastructure, you want to build a school, you want to build an educational system, you want to build high-speed rail or the next generation of transport. You want to work on the Arctic over the next 50 years. You need plans. So that is a logical exercise. And the leaders in the planning today are the Chinese and the Singaporeans, and maybe I would say parts of Northeast and Southeast and even Central Asia today. They are way ahead of the argumentative states, and that's a big plus. And supporting that is a very talented planning class. These are professionals who do this for a living, who are well paid, and by the way, who are glorified. And in 90% of the cases, they're not elected. Right? They're not elected, so they may not be legitimate in electoral terms or in democratic terms. They are legitimate because of their excellence, their competence, and the idea that the population largely supports their planning exercise. Now, there are weaknesses, but we'll return to those in a second. In the argumentative tradition, the main strength, of course, is feedback. The Chinese have a saying. They say the emperor is very far. That means regardless of the strength of the planning class or the emperor in Beijing or Peking at the time, the emperor is still very far from Chongqing, from Hong Kong, from Hubei. Okay, he cannot possibly know everything that's going on. There are insufficient feedback mechanisms, politically and electoral terms, from the media, which is constricted or self-deterring in many cases, from the academy, which also feels some self-deterrence, and so on, and even social media to a certain extent. So the argumentative tradition has feedback mechanisms. And these feedback mechanisms are one of the great strengths of democracies. You do a bad job in government, you're voted out if the electorate is serene at the time. Or even in public office, in power, you have constant opposition that checks your excesses or tries to correct your mistakes. And the media can provide a proxy for what the population is thinking, and that is maybe amplified by social media, sometimes in a pathological way, but often in an interesting way whereby the government in real time can figure out whether it's got the pulse of the population right. Now, of course, that can constrict the planning horizon, but those feedback mechanisms exist. They do not exist here in any meaningful way. And the other one, I would say, the big one, is federalism. Federalism is largely a democratic construct in a meaningful way, and it is a strength of the argumentative system. Remember, Russia calls itself the Russian Federation, but to be honest, the Russians don't know federalism at all. It's not a meaningful federalism, and even when they talk about federalism for Ukraine or other states, they don't really know what they're talking about. And the Ukrainians, in interpreting the federal message from Russia, also don't know what they're talking about because they're from the same Soviet and post-Soviet tradition. It is the democracies, Canada, Australia, the United States, that really feel and understand, and India, of course, feel and understand federalism. And federalism is a form of argument. It is argument between the center and the regions. So again, back to the argumentative nature of the system. These are two realities that don't exist in the algorithmic world, and they are great strengths. A weakness is planning. These have short-term horizons. I remember coming to the Privy Council office in Ottawa in the earliest days of my career and saying, I wonder whether, well, I'm sure somebody has a national plan and somebody knows where everything is going. And indeed, to my surprise, extremely professional colleagues and people, but nobody had a plan for anything beyond a year or two out. And that wasn't the general mentality. And it remains a problem in Canada and other federal democracies today. So, these hybrid states are looking at these two strengths and weaknesses and saying, what does a compromise variant look like for the 21st century? Well, arguably, it would be one that takes the strengths of each of these and guards against the weaknesses. So, hybrid would be a planning state, one that has a planning class as well, feedback mechanisms, and by the way, they need not be necessarily electoral feedback mechanisms. They could be new ones in the form of media feedback, academy feedback, some sort of political opposition, again, in countries that don't have the same democratic tradition that we might in the argumentative world. And of course, this is a new one, federalism. And the argument here that would be that to the extent that these argumentative states, these algorithmic states, forgive me, begin to federalize, that feedback mechanism is amplified, whether they intended it originally or not. And by the way, the value of the individual life in the federal system is greater than it is in the algorithmic system, because the algorithmic system supposes that the plan goes through the individual and over the individual in many ways, by its inexorable logic, whereas the federalism supposes or presupposes certain resistance on the ground, and in that the value of the individual life is amplified. That is just a question of the logic of the system rather than the relative moral quality of the Chinese system versus the Canadian or American system. Let me just say that the algorithmic system suffers terribly from these feedback mechanism deficiencies, and it knows it because it is always searching to understand what the population thinks. In China, and certainly in Russia, less algorithmic, more primitive, but in China, they're always searching to understand what the population thinks. They always have an information deficit. You may think of it as a surveillance state, but they lack those feedback. They're constantly inventing surveys and proxies and proto-federalism to be able to get that information. So that is a big weakness, and the feedback mechanisms correct mistakes. That is, the brightest people in Beijing in the algorithmic tradition may think they know something, but without that feedback mechanism they can make terrible mistakes, and it's the mistakes that can collapse the system. So a final note, this was what a hybrid governance looks like, and indeed many countries, you might take some of the countries in Central Asia or in the Middle East, parts of Africa, are looking at these very deliberately, as are, by the way, Singapore to some extent and Israel in the Middle East. They're saying, how can we more cleverly govern for the 21st century? If we're an algorithmic country, how can we introduce more material, more meaningful feedback mechanisms? And if we're in a democratic, argumentative country, how can we plan beyond our noses? And so that returns to the central question. How do we plan? That has yet to be invented, and by the way, in the Canadian context, that could be a major contribution to 21st century governance. If we can figure out how to plan in a federal democracy without losing our wits, and all the while delivering results for the people and for the world as a whole, we will survive. Irvin Studin back with you 3 weeks after we filmed this video. It's now out, but so too is the 10th anniversary issue of Global Brief. It's with subscribers nationally and globally imminently. If you haven't already got it in your hands, in stores around the world, Air Canada, Maple Leaf Lounges, enjoy. Very proud of our team, very proud of the product. So thanks for your support, your loyalty, your feedback. On the question of algorithmic and argumentative states, I hope you enjoyed our discussion about those two models, and of course where hybrid governance will go this century potentially. Two quick postscriptal reflections. First is that one of the cardinal weaknesses of the algorithmic tradition, one which I underemphasized, is of course the question of succession. And indeed you might say that in all of the algorithmic states and in many of the hybridic / voyeuristic states that are pivoting towards the algorithmic state, the question of succession still looms large. Look at the post-Soviet space from Russia to Ukraine, to Kyrgyzstan, to Uzbekistan, and of course Azerbaijan. There is a key question of what happens when you leave power. Can succession be peaceful? And that remains something that so far the argumentative tradition has been able to master with superiority vis-a-vis the algorithmic tradition. Even China will struggle with that problem, and that might even inform some of their current anxiety. Now, with respect to China in particular, the Hong Kong protest suggests a really interesting test case for what hybrid governance might look like this century. That is, you have a clash between an argumentative tradition, quasi-argumentative in Hong Kong, and a deeply algorithmic tradition in mainland China. Where they come together could be something quasi-federal if it's to work. Now, the algorithmic logic is to generalize the plan with deep consistency, without many exceptions, even crushing the individual en route, as I mentioned, because everything is in the service of the plan, even if the general welfare increases with some rapidity. The argumentative tradition pushes back and is consistent with federalism in its most elegant form. Canada, Australia, the United States, with great asymmetry between the jurisdictions. And that's something that is foreign to the algorithmic and the Chinese Singaporean understanding. But that is potentially where they may go if the outcome is not tragic.